Hello, class, and welcome to today's lecture on one of the most crucial aspects of professional ethics and counseling: duty to warn and protect. Now, imagine for a moment the weight of responsibility that comes with being entrusted with the well-being of others. As future counselors and addiction professionals, you will encounter individuals navigating some of the most complex emotional landscapes, facing incredible challenges that may lead to thoughts of harm to themselves or of others. And in these moments, your ethical obligation becomes paramount, requiring a very delicate balance between preserving client confidentiality and intervening to prevent potential harm. So today we're going to dive into the intricacies of duty to warn and protect and explore its legal and ethical foundations and how we can balance this in some kind of precarious way with confidentiality. So, as always, in today's lecture, I want to tell you a little story about an important figure, and then we'll dive into legal foundations and mandates, where we first off explore the history of the idea of duty to warn and protect, and some of the relevant laws and court cases, such as Tarasoff versus Regents of the University of California, which really significantly shaped counselor obligations in this area. And then we'll dive into some of the ethical considerations and principles and codes of conduct that guide counselors in fulfilling their duty to warn and protect. And we'll discuss some scenarios that will help us to kind of clarify that delicate balancing between client confidentiality and the obligation to prevent harm. And finally, risk assessment and management. And this includes evaluating the seriousness of threats and determining appropriate interventions. So, I want to start off by highlighting a important figure in the whole concept of duty to warn and protect in counseling. And this is Dr. Paul Applebaum of Columbia University in New York. Dr. Applebaum has been a well-respected psychiatrist and legal scholar that has done a lot of work to significantly shape the understanding of the implementation of ethical principles in mental health practice. And one of the concepts that he kind of came up with was exploring the idea of patient confidentiality and the balance of duty to protect potential victims. And in his seminal work on the Tarasoff doctrine and its implications for mental health professionals, he's really kind of dived into trying to clarify what are the legal obligations and guiding ethical decision-making principles in this field. So to kind of give you a little bit of background here, we'll tell you a little bit about what we mean by Tarasoff. So Tarasoff was a young college student whose tragic death way back in 1969 led to some very significant legal and ethical developments in mental health practice. So Titania Tarasoff, and her legacy really stems back to the landmark case of Tarasoff versus Regents of the University of California, which arose from her murder by a fellow student, a fellow by the name of Podar. And prior to her death, Tarasoff had confided in a university counselor about Podar's expressed intent to harm her. And despite this disclosure, the counselor did not warn or protect Tarasoff, leading to her tragic death. And the Tarasoff case resulted in a groundbreaking legal precedent establishing the duty of mental health professionals to warn potential victims of foreseeable harm posed by their clients. Now, this duty, known as the Tarasoff duty, has since become a cornerstone of ethical practice in counseling and psychology. And Titania Tarasov's legacy really kind of underscores the whole profound responsibility of mental health professionals that they have to prioritize the safety and well-being of people and their potential victims. And so it really kind of serves as a reminder that while there is this very important, and we can't overstate the importance of confidentiality, that when there is expressions of harm, desire for harm, that needs to be dealt with. So when we talk about the duty to warn and protect in counseling, we really are diving into an ethical minefield that we need to navigate very carefully. At its core, duty to warn and protect involves the duty of counselors to take some reasonable steps to prevent harm when they become aware of a client's potential for violence. And this duty really extends not only to the client themselves, but also to the potential victims who may be targeted by the client's actions. And so this encompasses a range of actions, including warning potential victims, notifying appropriate authorities, and taking necessary steps to ensure the safety of all parties involved. And some of the legal framework surrounding this whole policy was shaped by some relevant laws and court cases that established the legal responsibilities of mental health professionals. And of course, one of those most notable ones was the Tarasov versus Regents of the University of California, which set a precedent for the duty of mental health professionals to warn potential victims of foreseeable harm posed by their clients. And so this whole principle is outlined in professional associations such as the American Counseling Association and the American Psychological Association, and they really emphasize the paramount importance of client welfare and duty to protect individuals from harm. And so counselors are ethically obligated to balance the principles of beneficence and non-malfeasance, ensuring that their actions prioritize the safety and well-being of their clients and others. Now, while duty to warn and protect is essentially for assuring the safety of clients and potential victims, counselors may encounter some very challenging dilemmas in fulfilling this duty. There are obvious challenges related to things like confidentiality. When you reveal something that someone has shared, you are breaking confidentiality. And in so doing, you are causing irreparable harm to that therapeutic relationship. So that needs to be something that needs to be considered in there as well as the principle of client autonomy and the potential for unintended consequences of interventions. And so it's incumbent upon the counselor to navigate these complexities with some very careful consideration of the ethical principles, ideally some consultation with supervisors, and the overall understanding of the situation. So let's kind of dive into this a little bit deeper and kind of explore what we mean by this and some of the legal foundations for this. So the duty to warn and protect has been, as I mentioned, significantly influenced by many different legal decisions in many different places. But it really kind of stems back to the Tarasov versus Regents of the University of California, which wasn't really, even though the murder happened in 1969, really didn't kind of conclude until about 1976. So in this case, the California Supreme Court held that mental health professionals have the duty to warn potential victims of foreseeable harm posed by their clients. And so the court's decision established the Tarasov duty, that's generally what it's called, which has since been a guiding principle for counselors' obligations in many different jurisdictions. And so failure to fulfill this duty can result in legal liability for counselors and their employers. So there's a challenge there that needs to kind of be balanced between the care of the client in terms of confidentiality and the limits of confidentiality in the duty to warn and protect. Now, since the Tarasoff duty decision, there have been other legal mandates and statutes that govern duty to warn and protect in specific jurisdictions. And this is going to include things like mandatory reporting laws for certain types of harm, such as child abuse or elder abuse, as well as professional licensing regulations that outline counselors' responsibility in cases of potential harm. And so, when it comes to counselors in their practice, in order to be mindful of all of this, really need to be aware of the expectations of their professional association. So the things that I kind of focus on in this course are the American Counseling Association and the American Psychological Association, mainly because these are the largest, most politically influential groups for counseling in the United States. And they whatever they do tends to trickle down to all the other associations. And so it's the idea of acting in the best interest of the client while doing no harm. So it's the principles of beneficence and the principle of non-malfeasance that we're really kind of trying to follow along these lines of ethical considerations. So one of the primary ethical dilemmas that we have as counselors is fulfilling this duty to warn and protect. And I'm going to repeat this over and over again because it's very important. To balance that principle of confidentiality with the obligation to prevent harm. And I really want you to think about this. Confidentiality creates the intimate space that makes people feel safe to be part of that process. So breaking that is no small matter. Confidentiality is a cornerstone of the therapeutic relationship, and it fosters trust and openness between the counselor and client. So, if a client poses a serious threat of harm to themselves or others, and here's the thing that I really want you to be mindful of, it needs to be serious. A serious threat of harm to themselves or others. That's when you're required to breach confidentiality. But up until that point, it is your responsibility to maintain that confidentiality, because confidentiality is the key to healing for that individual. So there's a balance there. And I have seen historical cases where in cases like this, many professionals have argued that it's still something that confidentiality should still be held in those cases, because it's the last bastion of hope for people that need healing. But the law has decided otherwise. Now, in order to kind of carry this out, we need to ensure that counselors are engaged in that whole informed consent process with the clients, where they clearly outline what the limitations of confidentiality are and what circumstances under which the information may be disclosed to protect the client or others from harm. And so counselors need to conduct a thorough risk assessment to evaluate the seriousness of threats and determine appropriate interventions to mitigate that risk. And all of that is very important. And of course, the ethical practice and duty to warn and protect requires counselors to consider the cultural factors that may influence a client's perception of confidentiality and their willingness to disclose potential harm. So cultural competency is always something that needs to be of consideration here. What are the client's cultural beliefs and values, and how does that play into this whole scenario? And of course, Ethical practice should involve seeking supervision and consultation from some experienced colleagues or legal experts, which can help them navigate through this very complex ethical dilemma. So, consulting with peers can provide some valuable perspectives and some guidance in the kinds of choices that need to be made in these cases. Now, when you make risk assessments, and in order to make risk assessments, it really needs to be systematic when you're evaluating the likelihood and severity of potential harm posed by a client. So counselors need to gather some relevant information, such as what is the nature of the threat, how specific is the threat, okay? Do they have a plan? Is it specific? Do they have capability of carrying this out? Does the client have a history of violence or self-harm? And what are some other contextual factors that may increase or decrease the risk? And so risk assessment tools and protocols can aid counselors in systematically evaluating the risk factors and making informed decisions. And so it's also important to assess the seriousness of the threats made by the client. So you need to consider the factors like, how specific is it? How immediate is it? Is this something where you need to stop and call someone immediately? Is the threat credible? Is the threat specific? Is it imminent? Is it credible? And those always pose a higher risk of harm and may require some immediate intervention. Now, once the risk has been assessed, the counselor needs to determine the appropriate intervention in order to mitigate this risk and ensure safety. And this doesn't mean dropping a snail mail for the U.S. Postal Service to carry out. It requires a phone call. It requires some immediate face-to-face interactions in order to do that. And so the counselor will need to coordinate oftentimes with other professionals or community agencies to provide the necessary interventions. And maybe this requires psychiatric hospitalization, or maybe it requires law enforcement involvement. Those kinds of things are important to consider. Most jurisdictions will have a 72-hour hold rule, psychiatric hold rule, so you can take someone to a hospital and ask for a psychiatric assessment. And if for example, the person has a strong, imminent, and specific and immediate and credible threat, then they will be taken in and assessed for 72 hours. And during that time, a decision will be made what to do next. So throughout the whole risk assessment and management process, though, counselors need to always maintain good documentation about their assessment, about the kinds of interventions that were made, and communication both with the client and with other involved parties. And there needs to be some regular monitoring of the client's progress and reassessment of the risk in order to ensure that interventions remain effective and appropriate over time. And so by documenting and monitoring and by implementing evidence-based interventions, you are navigating this very difficult situation ethically and successfully, hopefully. Now, a little bit of a case study here. I just want you to kind of imagine that you're seeing a client, and we'll call this client Alex. And you've been seeing this client for several months to address issues related to things like anxiety and depression. And so during this session, Alex discloses that they have been experiencing intense anger and thoughts about harming their coworker, who they believe has been undermining them at work. And so Alex describes a very detailed plan to confront the coworker and express a desire to teach them a lesson. Now, in this case, the counselor is faced with a challenging dilemma that implicates the whole duty to warn and protect And so the counselor needs to assess the seriousness of the threat and take some appropriate action to prevent harm to the potential victim, while also maintaining trust and confidentiality and managing that therapeutic relationship. So what kind of steps would you take in this kind of case? Well, first off, remember, you need to assess. So, as the counselor, you will assess the risk. And so this means gathering the information about the nature and specificity of the threat. You're going to look at Alex's history of violence or aggression and any contextual factors that may increase or decrease that risk. Then you are going to talk with your colleague or your supervisor or a legal expert to get their guidance on how to proceed in a way that's ethical and legal in this situation. And the counselor in this case is going to collaborate and develop a safety plan with Alex and focus on some strategies to manage the anger and the conflict in a more constructive way, as well as identifying some alternate coping mechanisms and support resources. So, the thing that you need to keep in mind here is that you have a legal obligation regarding duty to warn and protect in jurisdictions and take appropriate steps to fulfill these obligations while respecting the client's confidentiality to the extent possible. Now, this has to be a serious and imminent threat. So in this case, we can say that teach the person a lesson means that she's going to have a stern conversation with the person. Maybe she'll raise her voice. Well, that isn't something that requires breaking confidentiality. And so you've consulted all this, you've done the assessment, and the decision in this case comes back that, okay, there is no need to break, but you went through the process, and it's important to go through that process and to document it. So that's just a little bit about the whole idea of duty to warn and protect. So when we talk about duty to warn and protect, what are we talking about? We are talking about the ethical and legal obligation of mental health professionals to take reasonable steps to prevent harm when they become aware of a client's serious threat of violence towards an identifiable victim. And when we talk about risk assessment, what are we talking about? Well, that is the systematic evaluation of the likelihood and the severity of potential harm posed by a client, including factors such as nature, specificity of threats, the client's history of violence or self-harm, and contextual factors. And then finally, what we mean by confidentiality. And of course, we are talking there about the ethical principle of maintaining the privacy and confidentiality of client information, except in situations where disclosure is required to prevent harm to the client or others. And the question for this week is, which legal case established the duty of mental health professionals to warn potential victims of foreseeable harm posed by their clients? And the answer there is Tarasoff versus the Regents of the University of California. Now, as we kind of close out this a little bit of abbreviated lecture, I just want you to kind of reflect upon the real difficulties here. There is the challenge of holding to the foundation of this therapeutic relationship, of having people trust us with their life secrets, and at the same time needing to balance that with potential harm of others or of themselves. And it is not an easy task, so don't carry that burden alone. Remember to stay engaged with other professionals. This is a time when having regular supervision and regular scheduled times of meeting with other professionals to discuss cases is extremely important, so that we can prioritize caring for our client, upholding the highest standards of ethical practice while prioritizing the safety and welfare of our clients and the community. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see you next week. You take care. Goodbye.